Picture this, the sun glinting off golden eagle standards as Roman legions march in perfect formation, an unstoppable force that conquered nations and forged an empire spanning continents. Now imagine those same soldiers, their armor battered, their discipline shattered, fleeing in chaos as enemies swarm over hills they once ruled. This wasn't just a bad day for Rome, it was the unthinkable. The empire that seemed invincible, the military machine that dominated the ancient world, brought to its knees not once, but over and over again. How could a superpower that ruled for centuries suffer such shocking defeats? What do these moments of collapse reveal about the true nature of empires and the fragility of even the mightiest civilizations? Today, we're peeling back the gilded layers of Roman history to expose its darkest, most humiliating hours. From forgotten battlefields to infamous massacres, we'll uncover 25 catastrophic defeats that shattered Rome's myth of invincibility. These aren't just tales of lost battles, they're stories of arrogance punished, strategies undone, and empires humbled. Think you know Roman history? Wait until you hear about the time an entire army vanished without a trace, or the general who led his troops into a trap so devastating it became a cautionary tale for millennia. Each of these disasters holds a mirror to the mistakes that toppled giants, lessons about overreach, betrayal, and the unpredictable tides of war that still resonate today. But this isn't just a parade of ancient failures. It's a journey into the heart of what makes and breaks a civilization, because Rome's greatest legacy isn't just its triumphs, it's the scars it earned along the way. Every crushing defeat forced the empire to adapt, to question its own supremacy, and in some cases, to rise stronger from the ashes. So if you've ever wondered how history's most disciplined war machine could falter, or what these ancient stumbles teach us about power today, stay with us. By the end of this video, you'll see Rome not as an untouchable colossus, but as something far more human, a reminder that even the mightiest can fall, and that every empire, no matter how glorious, has its Achilles heel. At its peak, Rome was a colossus legion stretched from the deserts of Syria to the misty highlands of Britain, crushing rebellions, absorbing kingdoms, and bending entire cultures to its will. This was an empire built on discipline, innovation, and an unshakable belief in its own destiny. Yet beneath the marble monuments and triumphant parades, cracks were already forming. Every conquest stretched Rome's resources thinner. Every new border demanded more soldiers, more gold, more grain. The same ambition that built the empire began to unravel it. Take the legendary rivalry between Scipio and Hannibal, a clash that exposed Rome's weaknesses even in victory. After Hannibal's army crossed the Alps and annihilated Roman forces at Cannae, it wasn't just the staggering loss of life that shook the Republic. It was the realization that their invincible legions could be outthought, outmaneuvered, and humiliated on their own soil. Scipio's eventual triumph masked a sobering truth. Rome's greatest strengths, rigid discipline, predictable tactics, could become liabilities against a cunning foe. But why does this matter today? Because empires don't collapse overnight. They crumble from 1,000 small fractures. The arrogance of assuming past success guarantees future victories. The blindness to changing tactics on the battlefield and in politics. The corrosive rot of internal greed and division. Rome's story could be ripped from modern headline superpowers overextending their reach, leaders mistaking size for strength, systems buckling under their own weight. And nowhere was this lesson more brutally taught than in the dark forests of Germania, where 3 legions marched in confident formation and vanished without a trace. The massacre at Teutoburg Forest wasn't just a military disaster. It was the moment Rome learned the hard way that no empire, no matter how vast, is truly unbreakable. The Battle of the Alia wasn't just a defeat, it was Rome's first catastrophic wake-up call, a humiliation so deep it scarred the city's memory for centuries. In the year 390 BC, the Gauls, a fierce warrior culture from the north, descended like a storm on the fledgling Roman Republic. Led by their chieftain Brennus, these towering fighters with their long swords and wild battle cries shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility. The legions, unprepared and overconfident, made a fatal error. They deployed in thin, stretched lines along the Alia River, assuming discipline alone would carry the day. But the Gauls didn't fight by Rome's rules. They crashed through the defenses with brute force, turning the riverbanks into a slaughterhouse. Panic spread like wildfire. Roman soldiers threw down their shields and ran, some drowning in the Tiber as they fled. The road to Rome lay undefended. Within days, Brennus stood atop the Capitoline Hill, his warriors looting the city's heart. The stories of that sack became legend. Senators sitting motionless in their robes, refusing to flee as Gauls ransacked their homes. The sacred geese of Juno, whose honking alerted defenders to a nighttime attack. But the most enduring moment came when the Romans begged for peace. Brennus demanded a ransom of gold. As the weighed metal was brought, the Romans protested that the scales were rigged. The Gallic chieftain threw his sword onto the balance with a sneer, uttering the immortal words, "Woe to the vanquished." It wasn't just a taunt, it was a lesson etched in blood. Rome survived, but nothing was the same after Alia. The city rebuilt its walls, not just with stone, but with a newfound humility. Military reforms followed: deeper formations, better armor, a focus on flexibility over rigid tradition. Most importantly, the Romans learned the cost of underestimating an enemy. Yet this early trauma also bred a quiet ruthlessness. Decades later, when Rome finally crushed the Gauls in battle, they made sure no one would ever say, "Woe to the vanquished" again. The Republic's rise began here, in the ashes of its greatest shame. But Alia was just the beginning. Rome's next disaster would prove that even superior tactics weren't enough when arrogance blinded its leaders, a lesson waiting in the forests of Teutoburg, where an entire army would vanish without a trace. The Caudine Forks wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare, a humiliation so precise it became shorthand for military disgrace. Picture this: 2 Roman legions, thousands of men in gleaming armor, marching confidently into a narrow mountain pass in southern Italy. The consuls leading them expected a straightforward campaign against the Samnites, Rome's rebellious allies. But the Samnites had other plans. Their leader, Gaius Pontius, didn't meet Rome head-on. Instead, he lured the legions into a trap so clever, so devastating, it would haunt Roman generals for centuries. As the Romans entered the winding defile, they found the exit blocked by felled trees and boulders. Turning back, they saw the entrance sealed behind them. Trapped like cattle in a slaughterhouse with no room to maneuver or fight, the legions waited days without food or water, their discipline crumbling into desperation. When Pontius finally offered terms, the consuls had no choice but to surrender. But the real cruelty came next. The Samnites didn't slaughter their prisoners. They did something far worse. They forced the Romans to pass under the yoke, a makeshift arch of spears, beneath which each soldier had to crawl, unarmed, in full view of their enemies. It was a ritual of submission, stripping away not just their weapons but their dignity. Livy's account seethes with the Senate's fury. Better to have died on your swords than live branded by such shame. This wasn't just a tactical failure. It exposed a fatal flaw in Rome's military mindset. The legions were unbeatable in open battle. their tight formations and drilled maneuvers crushing foes on flat ground. But against guerrilla tactics, ambushes, feints, the unpredictable terrain of the Apennines, they were dangerously rigid. The Caudine Forks forced Rome to confront its arrogance. Over time, they adapted, learning to scout ahead, value flexibility, and respect enemies who fought outside the rules. Yet the sting of the yoke lingered. Years later, when Rome finally defeated the Samnites, they repaid the insult in kind, humiliating their foes with the same ritual. The lesson: pride could be as deadly as any sword. And the next challenge waiting for Rome would prove even more dangerous: a tactical genius named Pyrrhus, whose victories would come at a cost so high they'd etch his name into history. The dust hung thick over Cannae that August day in 216 BC, so heavy that soldiers choked on it as they marched. Rome had never assembled a force this large, 80,000 men, a staggering show of might to crush the Carthaginian invader Hannibal once and for all. But numbers meant nothing against genius. Hannibal didn't just defeat Rome at Cannae. He orchestrated a slaughter so perfect military academies still study it 2,000 years later. The trap began with deception. Hannibal arranged his center in a crescent, weak and deliberately buckling as the Roman legions pushed forward, drunk on false momentum. What they didn't see were the hardened African veterans waiting on the flanks, or the cavalry sweeping behind to seal the noose. When the Carthaginian wings closed in, the Roman advance became a death sentence. Packed shoulder to shoulder in the suffocating heat, soldiers couldn't raise their swords, couldn't retreat, couldn't even fall as the ranks behind pressed them forward into the butcher's embrace. Livy's account spares no horror: men standing on corpses to fight, wounded troops biting at enemy ankles when their arms failed, the Tiber running red miles downstream. By dusk, 50,000 Romans lay dead. It remains one of the bloodiest single days in military history. Yet Rome's survival after Cannae is just as astonishing as the defeat itself. The Senate refused to even discuss surrender, recruiting slaves and teenagers to fill the legions. Why? Because Hannibal won the battle but misjudged his enemy's resolve. Rome's true strength wasn't just its armies, it was an entire society willing to bleed itself dry rather than yield. The man who finally avenged Cannae, Scipio Africanus, learned Hannibal's tactics but paired them with Roman tenacity, turning the Carthaginians' own strategies against him at Zama. But not all of Rome's enemies could be outthought. Some defeats came not from clever generals, but from the land itself, like the mountains of Carrhae, where the very air betrayed the legions. The Teutoburg Forest swallowed the legions whole. In 9 AD, 3 of Rome's finest divisions, 17,000 men, marched into those tangled Germanic woods and never came out. This wasn't just a battle lost, it was an entire army erased, a vanishing so complete it left Emperor Augustus tearing his robes and howling into the palace halls, "Varus, give me back my legions." The disaster didn't just break Rome's northern ambitions, it exposed the empire's fatal blind spot: trust. The man who orchestrated the massacre, Arminius, wasn't some wild barbarian chieftain. He was Rome's own, raised as a hostage, trained in Latin tactics, even granted equestrian rank. He'd fought alongside the very legions he now trapped. When he whispered to Governor Varus of a rebellion deep in the forest, it wasn't just a lie, it was revenge dressed as loyalty. The weather turned first. Torrents of autumn rain slicked the narrow paths into mud, forcing the legions to stretch out in a vulnerable line miles long. Then came the war cries from the mist. Germanic warriors who'd spent years studying Roman formations attacked not head-on but in flickering strikes, ambushing, retreating, luring the heavy infantry deeper into the slaughterhouse. By the third day, the survivors were impaled on thorn hedges, their skulls nailed to sacred oaks, the psychological shockwave reached further than any battlefield. Augustus, who'd spent decades selling Rome as destiny's chosen empire, now ordered frantic conscriptions and posted guards in the streets to prevent panic. The Rhine frontier, once a launchpad for expansion, became a defensive ditch, and Arminius, he became a folk hero, proof that Rome's civilizing mission was just polished conquest. The forest itself became a monument decades later. Roman soldiers stumbling upon the bone-strewn field reportedly broke rank to weep as they buried their comrades. Yet Teutoburg's true lesson wasn't about terrain or betrayal. It revealed the cost of imperial overreach. Rome could dominate open lands where legions marched in sunlight, but some frontiers, thick with trees, tribes, and grudges, refused to be tamed. And just when the empire thought it had learned its lesson, another rebellion would erupt, this time not in the wilderness, but in the very heart of Roman Britain. There, a warrior queen would prove that even the empire's subjects could turn its own weapons against it. Spartacus was supposed to die quietly in the arena, a nameless body crumpled in the sand for Rome's amusement. Instead, the Thracian gladiator became the nightmare the Republic couldn't wake from, a slave who turned his chains into weapons and exposed the rot at the heart of Rome's prosperity. It began with 70 men escaping a Capuan training school, armed with kitchen knives and rage. Within months, that band swelled to 70,000. An army of freed slaves, shepherds, and outcasts who burned villas, humiliated praetors, and carved a path of vengeance through Italy's spine. The Senate's response reeked of panic. First, they sent inexperienced praetors, assuming mere legionary prestige would scatter the rebels. Spartacus outmaneuvered them all, using the Apennines like a fortress and Rome's own roads to strike where least expected. His greatest trick, turning the tools of oppression against their masters. Gladiators trained to kill for spectacle now taught their skills to farmers and miners, forging a guerrilla force that fought with nothing to lose. Ancient historians like Plutarch grudgingly admitted his genius, how he split Roman forces with feints or used captured armor to infiltrate camps. Then came Crassus. The richest man in Rome, hungry for military glory, demanded total war. His tactics were as merciless as his ambition. When initial attacks failed, he revived the ancient punishment of decimation, executing every 10th man in cowardly units by club and sword. The final showdown at the Silarus River was less a battle than a massacre. Spartacus, legend claims, charged straight at Crassus's lines, seeking death on his own terms. 6,000 survivors were nailed to crosses along the Appian Way, a gruesome warning stretching 130 miles. The bodies stayed there for years, rotting in plain sight, a testament to Rome's fear disguised as justice. Yet Spartacus's revolt left wounds no victory could heal. It proved Rome's economy relied on brutality so extreme, it bred its own destruction. The slaves weren't just laborers, they were prisoners of war, kidnapped children, skilled artisans treated like livestock. Their uprising forced the Republic to confront a truth it preferred to ignore. Empires built on chains will always face the day those chains snap. And just as Rome finished swallowing this bitter lesson, the sea itself rose against them. Off the coast of Sicily, a storm was gathering that would swallow fleets, whole proof that even nature scorned the arrogance of empires. Rome's first great naval disaster began with arrogance and ended in the howling winds of a vengeful sea. The year was 249 BC, and the Republic, fresh from its land victories against Carthage, made a fatal miscalculation, believing brute force could conquer the waves as easily as the open field. At Drepana, off Sicily's western coast, Consul Publius Claudius Pulcher faced Carthaginian Admiral Adherbal, a master of maritime warfare. What followed wasn't just a defeat, it was a lesson in hubris written in seawater and splintered timber. Pulcher's plan relied on surprise, a night attack to break the Carthaginian blockade. But the gods, it seemed, favored Carthage that night. His fleet, crammed with inexperienced rowers and hastily built ships, arrived late, their oars clashing in the pre-dawn gloom. Hannibal, warned by scouts, had already maneuvered his agile quinquiremes into open water. What should have been a Roman ambush became a slaughter. Carthaginian vessels, faster and expertly crewed, rammed Roman hulls at will, their marines boarding with practiced ease. By midday, 93 Roman ships were sinking or captured, their crews drowning beneath the weight of their own armor. Then came the storm. As the shattered remnants of Pulcher's fleet limped home, a tempest rose without warning. The kind, seasoned sailors whispered about in taverns. Waves taller than temples smashed the already crippled galleys, swallowing whole ships in moments. The few survivors spoke of men clinging to wreckage only to be dashed against rocks, their screams lost in the gale. When the winds finally stilled, Rome had lost not just the battle but nearly its entire navy. Over 100,000 oarsmen and legionaries vanished beneath the waves. Drepana exposed a painful truth. Rome's strength on land meant nothing at sea. Their ships, built by land-bound engineers, were sluggish compared to Carthage's sleek designs. Their rowers, often slaves chained to benches, lacked the skill of Carthage's professional sailors. Most damning of all was Pulcher's reported defiance before the battle. When the sacred chickens refused to eat, an ill omen, he allegedly threw them overboard, snarling, then let them drink. The Senate later fined him for sacrilege, but the real punishment was history's judgment. Drepana became synonymous with reckless pride, yet Rome, as always, adapted. Within years, they studied Carthaginian shipbuilding, copied their tactics, and even added a deadly innovation: the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned sea battles into land fights. But just as they mastered one enemy, another emerged, not from the sea this time, but from the eastern deserts, where a cunning monarch would prove that even Rome's new naval prowess couldn't shield it from strategic genius. The king of Pontus was watching, and he had plans of his own. The sun burned white over Carrhae in 53 BC, a pitiless glare reflecting off 7 Roman legions' polished armor as they trudged deeper into Mesopotamia. This was Marcus Licinius Crassus's moment, the richest man in Rome, hungry for the military glory his wealth couldn't buy, but the desert had other plans. What followed wasn't just a battle lost, it was a massacre that redefined the limits of Roman power, proving that gold and heavy infantry meant nothing against the wind and the horse lords of Parthia. Crassus's arrogance blinded him from the start, ignoring local guides who warned of the Parthians' hit-and-run tactics. He pushed his men into open sands where the enemy's strength mobility could shine. The Parthian general Shauna had just 10,000 men to Rome's 40,000, but everyone was mounted. Cataphracts in scale armor charged like living battering rams, while horse archers circled the legions, their composite bows raining arrows with terrifying precision. Plutarch's account chills with detail: Roman shields bristling like porcupines as shafts punched through armor, soldiers clawing at their own eyes when arrows pinned limbs to torsos. The heat did the rest. Trapped in a shrinking square, men dropped from thirst, their lips cracking as Parthian drums mocked their agony. Then came the betrayal. Crassus, desperate, agreed to parley, only to be stabbed during the meeting, his head and right hand severed as trophies. The legends say Parthian King Orodes poured molten gold down the dead general's throat, a grotesque jest about his insatiable greed. Whether true or not, the symbolism stung Rome to its core. Carrhae wasn't just a defeat, it was a cultural reckoning. For the first time, Rome faced an enemy whose warfare was alien to everything the legions understood. No fixed lines to break, no cities to besiege, just endless space and arrows whispering death from beyond reach. The disaster forced Rome to confront its eastern blind spot. No amount of road building or siegecraft could conquer the steppes. Future emperors would learn to negotiate with Parthia rather than challenge it head-on, a lesson Augustus took to heart. But just as Rome adapted to one frontier, another betrayal brewed closer to home, this time not from foreign horsemen, but from allies who'd once fought beneath the eagle standards. The Germanic tribes remembered Teutoburg, and their patience was wearing thin. The fields of Arausio ran red in 105 BC, not from the setting sun, but from a slaughter so vast it scarred Rome's memory for generations. 80,000 legionaries lay butchered along the Rhone that day, their bodies piled like cordwood by the victorious Cimbri and Teutones Germanic tribes, whose very names became synonyms for terror. This wasn't just a battle lost, it was a systemic collapse, a failure so colossal it laid bare the rot festering in Rome's political heart. Two consuls shared command that fateful year: Gnaeus Mallius Maximus, a political appointee with scant military experience, and Quintus Servilius Scipio, a patrician who'd rather see Rome fall than share glory with a social inferior. Their mutual hatred doomed the army before a single sword was drawn. When the Cimbri offered to negotiate, Scipio, camped separately out of spite, attacked alone, hoping to steal victory. His reckless charge shattered against the tribe's shield wall, and as his men fled in panic, they crashed into Mallius's unprepared forces. The Germanic warriors, sensing chaos, closed the trap. Livy's fragments describe the horror. The wounded were trampled by their own cavalry, the river choked with armor and corpses. The few who escaped were hunted like game through the olive groves. Arausio's aftermath forced Rome to confront its own decay. The Republic's tradition of shared command, meant to prevent tyranny, had become a death sentence when vanity overruled survival. Enter Gaius Marius, a gruff, no-nonsense general who scrapped the old system entirely. His reforms were revolutionary: a professional standing army open to landless volunteers, standardized training, and legions loyal not to feuding senators but to their commanders. The Marian reforms didn't just rebuild the military, they reshaped Roman society, turning soldiers from citizen farmers into career fighters. Yet even Marius's new model army couldn't erase the trauma of Arausio. The Cimbri and Teutones, emboldened by their victory, rampaged through Gaul for years, their very approach sparking panic in the streets of Rome. It would take another decade, and the blood-soaked fields of Vercelli before Marius finally avenged the disgrace. But just as Rome began to heal, another rebellion flared. This time not from wild tribes, but from a corner of the empire thought long pacified. A single city in Spain, its name barely known to the Senate, would defy the eagles for generations, proving that even the smallest spark could ignite an endless war. Numantia should have been a footnote, a minor rebellion crushed in months, its name forgotten like countless others. Instead, this tiny Celtiberian town became Rome's nightmare, a stubborn splinter that festered for 20 long years. Perched on a rocky hill in northern Spain, its mud brick walls held no grandeur, its warriors no match for legionary discipline on paper. Yet Numantia taught Rome a humbling lesson: conquest isn't just about strength, but the will to endure. The first Roman armies to arrive expected quick surrender. They left in disgrace. Numantia's defenders, though outnumbered, knew their land intimately, every gully, every hidden spring. They struck like ghosts, ambushing foraging parties, poisoning wells, melting into the hills after each raid. Rome sent consul after consul, each failing harder than the last. In one infamous humiliation, An entire army under Hostilius Mancinus was surrounded and forced to surrender, its soldiers stripped of weapons and paraded naked through the town. The Senate, rather than acknowledge defeat, declared the treaty invalid and sent Mancinus back to Numantia bound in chains as a sacrificial offering. The Numantines, unimpressed, let him go. Enter Scipio Aemilianus, the destroyer of Carthage. He arrived in 134 BC with a chilling strategy. If Numantia couldn't be stormed, it would be strangled. His legions built a wall 9 miles long, studded with towers, sealing off every path in or out. Then they waited for 16 months. Numantine desperation turned to horror as hunger gnawed at them. They ate leather, then rats, then the dead. When survivors finally staggered out, skeletal and hollow-eyed, Scipio burned the town to ashes, selling the few left standing into slavery. Rome celebrated a triumph, but the cost reeked of moral decay. This wasn't victory, it was exhaustion. Numantia's defiance haunted Rome's conscience, a whisper that empire building had a price even gold couldn't cover. And as Scipio's men dismantled their siege works, another lesson loomed. Allies could be just as dangerous as enemies. Across the Adriatic, a kingdom Rome had called friend was sharpening its knives, waiting for the moment to strike at the empire's exposed back. The mist clung to Lake Trasimene like a burial shroud on that June morning in 217 BC, so thick Roman soldiers could barely see the man in front of them. Consul Gaius Flaminius, eager to prove himself after Hannibal's early victories, had pushed his legions hard through the night, chasing shadows of the Carthaginian army. What he didn't realize, what the fog concealed, was that Hannibal wasn't running. He was waiting. The ambush that unfolded wasn't just a battle. It was a masterpiece of psychological terror, a slaughterhouse disguised as a lakeside road. Hannibal had studied the terrain like a sculptor eyeing marble. The narrow pass between the water and the hills was a natural killing ground. His men hid in the mist, Libyan infantry behind the ridges, Spanish cavalry blocking the rear, Gauls howling from the trees. When the Romans marched into the trap, the attack came from everywhere at once. Soldiers stumbled blindly into javelins materializing from the fog. The lake turned red as men in heavy armor waded in, only to drown under the weight of their own equipment. Flaminius died early, cut down by a Gaulish chieftain who later boasted of stripping the consul's engraved armor. By noon, 15,000 Romans lay dead. The few survivors fled into the marshes where the Carthaginians hunted them like animals. What made Trasimene so damning wasn't just the scale of the loss, it was Rome's refusal to learn. Flaminius had ignored every warning. Scouts reported suspicious movements, he dismissed them. Advisors urged caution, he called them cowards. Even the gods seemed to protest. His horse stumbled on the march, and sacrificial organs showed ominous signs. Yet, like so many Roman leaders before him, Flaminius mistook recklessness for courage. The Senate had underestimated Hannibal at the Trebia, then again at Lake Trasimene, and soon they'd pay an even steeper price at Cannae. But Hannibal's greatest weapon wasn't his ambushes, it was his understanding of Roman pride. He knew they'd keep charging headlong into traps rather than admit an enemy outthought them. And as the Carthaginian general surveyed the carnage at Trasimene, he already had his next move planned. Because while Rome licked its wounds, a Hellenistic king across the Adriatic was watching. And he'd soon show the world that humiliation could come not just from battlefields, but from diplomacy's poisoned kiss. Zama should have been Rome's perfect victory, the moment Scipio Africanus, the Republic's brightest general, finally outmaneuvered Hannibal on an open field. The textbooks call it a masterpiece, the battle that broke Carthage back and ended the Second Punic War. But peel back the laurels and a different story emerges. Hannibal, even in defeat, pulled off a tactical miracle that exposed Rome's brittle glory. The battlefield was a chessboard of desperation. Hannibal, after 16 years of ravaging Italy, had been forced home to defend Carthage itself. His army was a patchwork: mercenaries, citizen levies, and the hardened veterans who'd crossed the Alps with him. Against them, Scipio fielded Rome's finest, plus a secret weapon, Massinissa's Numidian cavalry, riders who could turn the flanks like a scalpel. The clash was brutal, but history remembers it wrong. Hannibal's frontline infantry collapsed quickly, yes, but that was the plan. They were expendable, a screen to absorb Roman momentum. His second line, African veterans, held longer, bleeding Scipio's legions. Then came the trap within the trap. Hannibal's reserve, his legendary Italian veterans, stood fresh on a slight rise, forcing the exhausted Romans to fight uphill. Here's where the myth unravels. When Scipio's cavalry finally circled back to attack the rear, Hannibal didn't panic. He folded his lines inward, creating a shrinking pocket of resistance so tight Roman numbers meant nothing. As Livy grudgingly admits, the butchery was mutual. Rome's casualties were nearly as grim as Carthage. Then came Hannibal's masterstroke, retreat. He led his surviving elites off the field in orderly ranks, a fighting withdrawal so disciplined, Scipio dared not pursue. Carthage lost the war that day, but Hannibal salvaged something far more precious: his core veterans, the men who'd made Rome tremble for a generation. They'd fight again. Zama's dirty secret: Rome couldn't afford victories like this. The Republic was bankrupt, its farms ruined, its people exhausted. Another 5 years of war, and Carthage might have bled them dry. Scipio's triumph papered over the cracks, but the cost was unsustainable, a lesson Rome would ignore until its next crisis. And that crisis came from an unexpected place, not from foreign foes, but from its own legions, who'd soon realize their swords could win more than battles. They could crown emperors. The age of generals turned warlords was dawning, and the next defeat wouldn't be on some distant field, but in the very heart of Rome's power. The Republic's fate was already written, it just didn't know it yet. The heat shimmered over the plains of Adrianople on that August day in 378 AD. The air thick with the stench of sweat and dust as Emperor Valens's legions formed their battle lines. Rome hadn't seen a disaster like this since Cannae, but this time the empire wouldn't recover. The Gothic refugees they'd allowed across the Danube years earlier, hungry and desperate, had become an avalanche of vengeance. What began as a bureaucratic blunder, officials extorting starving Goths for food in exchange for their children as slaves, exploded into a revolt that would change history. Valens, arrogant and impatient, refused to wait for reinforcements from his nephew Gratian in the west. He marched straight into the Gothic camp outside Adrianople, confident his disciplined infantry could crush what he saw as a rabble. But the Goths weren't playing by Rome's rules. Their cavalry, heavier and faster than anything the empire had faced, waited hidden behind hills. When the legions pushed forward, the Gothic horsemen descended like a scythe, cutting the Roman lines to pieces. The infantry, packed too tightly to maneuver, became a slaughterhouse. Valens himself fell, his body lost in the chaos, some say burned alive in a peasant's hut where he'd taken shelter. 2/3 of the Eastern army died that day, their eagles trampled into the mud. Adrianople wasn't just a lost battle. It shattered the myth that Rome could absorb barbarians endlessly without consequence. The Goths, now armed with captured Roman weapons, weren't just raiders, they were a rival power inside the empire's borders. For the first time, cavalry, not infantry, ruled the battlefield, a shift that would define warfare for the next 1,000 years. The Eastern Empire limped on, but the West never truly recovered. And just as Rome reeled from this catastrophe, an even graver threat emerged, not from open battle this time, but from within the empire's own walls. The sack of Rome in 410 wasn't just an invasion. It was a betrayal by those the empire had trusted most, proving that even stone could crumble when loyalty turned to dust. The gates of Rome groaned open on August 24, 410 AD, not by force but by betrayal. For 800 years, the Eternal City had stood unbreached, its walls a symbol of divine favor. Now they swung wide for Alaric's Visigoths, an army of refugees turned, conquerors who'd been promised land and dignity, only to be starved and cheated by a corrupt administration. What followed wasn't just a sack, it was the unraveling of 1,000 years of certainty. Alaric's men entered with eerie discipline, avoiding the indiscriminate slaughter Romans expected from barbarians. They targeted wealth, not lives, stripping gold from temples, melting statues, even hauling away the imperial Princess Galla Placidia as a bargaining chip. But the real damage was psychological. St. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, captured the empire's shock. The city which took the whole world was itself taken. For Romans raised on myths of invincibility, the unthinkable had happened. The Senate's own slaves, many of them Goths, opened doors to looters. The mausoleums of Augustus and Hadrian were desecrated, their ashes scattered. And the people, they watched in numb horror as the Visigoths held mock triumphs in the Forum, draping themselves in stolen togas. Yet the sack's brilliance lay in its restraint. Alaric, a Christian himself, ordered churches spared. His goal wasn't destruction, it was leverage. After 3 days, he left Rome hollowed but standing, a calculated insult to prove the empire's impotence. The message was clear: Rome could no longer protect its own heart. But this was just the first tremor. 20 years later, a far deadlier sack would come, not from Goths seeking recognition, but from Vandals intent on erasure. And this time, the city wouldn't just be looted. It would be gutted like a sacrificial animal, its treasures shipped to Carthage as the Western Empire gasped its last breaths. The Vandals didn't just sack Rome in 455 AD. They stripped it bare, methodically, almost surgically, as if erasing the city's soul piece by piece. Where Alaric's Visigoths had been calculating, leaving Rome humiliated but intact, King Gaisaric's forces arrived with a colder purpose: total extraction. For 14 days they scoured every temple, palace, and home, prying gilded tiles from rooftops, smelting bronze statues into ingots, even tearing the copper plating from the Pantheon's dome. The term vandalism was born here, not from mindless destruction, but from the chilling efficiency of this plunder, proof that empires could be dismantled like machines. What made this sack so devastating wasn't just the loot, it was Rome's utter helplessness. Emperor Petronius Maximus, who'd seized power just months earlier, fled on horseback as the Vandals breached the gates, only to be stoned to death by his own citizens. No legions rushed to defend the capital. The West's armies were ghosts, spread thin, defending crumbling frontiers. Pope Leo I, who'd negotiated with Attila the Hun a decade earlier, could only watch as Gaisaric's men loaded ships with treasures accumulated over centuries. The spoils of Jerusalem's temple, the imperial jewels, even the widow of the late Emperor Valentinian, dragged away with her daughters as prisoners. Yet the Vandals' true victory was symbolic. They didn't just take Rome's wealth, they took its myth of eternity. When Gaisaric's fleet sailed back to Carthage, hulls groaning with loot, they carried something far heavier than gold: the unspoken truth that the Western Empire was now a hollow shell, its fate decided not in Senate chambers but on pirate decks. And as the last Vandal ship vanished over the horizon, the stage was set for history's quietest apocalypse. not with a battle cry, but with a Germanic mercenary's shrug as he deposed the final emperor. The end, when it came, would be less a fall than a sigh. The boy emperor never stood a chance. Romulus Augustulus, barely 14 years old when Germanic mercenaries stormed his palace in 476 AD, was less a ruler than a prop, his very name a cruel joke. Romulus evoked Rome's mythic founder, Augustulus a miniature Augustus, but this wasn't the rebirth of empire. It was its quiet euthanasia. When the barbarian general Odoacer demanded his surrender, the child didn't even resist. He simply handed over the imperial diadem like a schoolboy returning a borrowed toy. There were no last stands, no heroic speeches, just a single sentence in the history books. The Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. Yet this whisper of an ending had been centuries in the making. Rome didn't fall because Odoacer's sword was sharp. It fell because the empire's spine had rotted away. The legions were now just bands of foreign mercenaries loyal only to their paymasters. The Senate, once the heart of republican virtue, had become a hollow club for wealthy landowners. And the emperor's puppets swapped out like broken dolls by Germanic generals behind the throne. Odoacer didn't conquer Rome, he inherited its corpse. The real tragedy wasn't the coup itself, but how little changed. Life trudged on, farmers still plowed fields, merchants still haggled in forums, even the old bureaucracy kept stamping papers. The only difference, no more imperial couriers arrived from Ravenna demanding taxes. For most Romans, the fall felt less like an apocalypse and more like a sigh of relief. But history has a way of burying its pivotal moments in anticlimax. While Romulus slunk off to a comfortable retirement in Campania, the East still clung to the illusion of unity. Constantinople's emperors would keep pretending the West could be reclaimed for centuries, sending feudal gold to pretend kings like Theodoric. The truth: Rome's fate had been sealed long before Odoacer in the poisoned wells of Adrianople, the greedy hands of corrupt tax collectors. The day generals realized purple robes could be taken as easily as they were given. And just when the empire seemed finished with surprises, its ghost would rise one last time, not in Italy, but in the African sun, where a forgotten Roman general mounted a revenge so audacious, it nearly rewrote history. The Vandals, who danced on Rome's grave, were about to meet the empire's final, furious gasp. The year 251 AD dawned with Rome already bleeding from 1,000 cuts. The empire, once a monolith of order, now teetered on the brink as Goths, Persians, and plagues tore at its edges. But nothing prepared the legions for the horror at Abritus, a swampy battlefield in Mosia where Emperor Decius, the first Roman ruler to fall in combat against barbarians, met a fate so gruesome it became legend. His skull, stripped of flesh and rimmed with gold, would later pass among Gothic chieftains as a drinking cup, a grisly testament to how far Rome's aura of invincibility had crumbled. Decius had marched east to crush the Gothic warlord Seneca, confident his disciplined legions could repeat past victories. But Seneca wasn't just another raider, he was a strategist who turned Rome's own tactics against it. Luring the imperial army into a bog, his warriors used the terrain like a weapon. Roman formations, trained for open battle, sank into the mire, their heavy armor becoming death traps. Arrows rained from concealed positions, and when Decius's son Hirnius fell first, the emperor allegedly charged forward in grief, only to be swallowed by the chaos. The Goths left no body to bury. Later accounts whispered of Seneca toasting his victories with Decius's skull, a deliberate desecration meant to break Rome's spirit. Abritus wasn't just a military disaster, it was a symptom of the 3rd century's unraveling. Emperors now ruled in months, not years, assassinated as quickly as they were proclaimed. The economy collapsed as silver coins turned to worthless tin. Plagues hollowed out cities, and with every barbarian breakthrough, the empire's borders grew more porous. Decius's death proved a grim new rule. No ruler was sacred, no army invincible. Yet even as the Goths celebrated, a far older enemy watched from the east. Persia, rebuilt under the ruthless Sassanid dynasty, saw Rome's weakness as an invitation. Within years, they'd strike with a humiliation so complete it would make Decius's fate seem merciful, capturing an emperor alive and turning him into a human footstool. The message was clear. Rome's wounds were now openings, and every predator in the ancient world smelled blood. The sands outside Edessa shimmered with more than just heat in 260 AD. They burned with humiliation. Emperor Valerian, leading the largest Roman army assembled in decades, had marched east to punish the Sassanid king Shapur for raiding Syria. Instead, he walked into history's most degrading imperial captivity. The details still sting. Tricked into negotiations, Valerian and his entire staff were seized, their purple cloaks torn away as they knelt in the dust. But Shapur wasn't satisfied with mere imprisonment. Persian records boast of using the emperor as a human footstool, mounting his horse by stepping on Valerian's back. Later, when the broken ruler died in chains, his skin was allegedly stuffed with straw and displayed in a Zoroastrian temple, a grotesque trophy for generations to gawk at. This wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a geopolitical earthquake. Rome's eastern frontier had always been its soft underbelly, where scorching deserts and cunning Persian horsemen negated the legion's strength. The Sassanids weren't like Parthia, whom Rome had bullied for centuries. They were a centralized, fanatical power with siege engineers to match Rome's and cavalry that outmaneuvered anything the empire could field. Valerian's blunders exposed these weaknesses brutally, divided command, overstretched supply lines, and most damningly, the belief that imperial prestige alone could intimidate Shapur. The psychological shockwave rippled further than the military loss. Coins minted afterward tellingly omit Valerian's name, as if Rome tried to memory hole its shame. Cities from Alexandria to Antioch braced for Persian raids now that the empire's invincibility mask had slipped. And in the chaos, an unlikely savior emerged: Odenathus, a Pomeran nobleman who rallied the remnants of Valerian's army and pushed Shapur back across the Euphrates. But his loyalty came at a price: semi-independence for Palmyra, a crack in imperial unity that would soon split wide open. Yet even as Rome licked its eastern wounds, the sea itself turned against them. That same year, off the coast of Asia Minor, a storm gathered that would prove no empire, no matter how mighty, could outlast the fury of nature. The waters near Cyprus were about to swallow a fleet whole, a disaster so complete it vanished from history books until fishermen's nets snagged on ancient anchors centuries later. The waters off Cape Bon burned in 468 AD, not with the sunset but with Rome's last hope going up in flames. Emperor Leo of the Eastern Empire had gambled everything on this final strike against the Vandals, a colossal fleet of over 1,000 ships carrying 40,000 men, the largest naval force assembled since the Punic Wars. It wasn't just an invasion, it was a desperate bid to reclaim Africa, Rome's breadbasket, from the barbarians who'd stolen it. But the Vandals, masters of the sea they'd once feared, had a surprise waiting. As the Roman armada approached the Carthaginian coast, the horizon suddenly blazed with drifting hulks of old ships, their decks crammed with brush and pitch. Fire ships, the tactic was as simple as it was brutal. Vandal sailors set the floating pyres adrift with the wind at their backs, sending them careening into the packed Roman galleys. Panic spread faster than the flames. Oars tangled as ships veered wildly, their hulls igniting like kindling. The stench of burning pitch mixed with screams as marines leaped into shark-infested waters. By dawn, half the fleet was ash, the rest scattered. The Vandals, led by the cunning king Gaiseric, picked off survivors at leisure. Rome's grand reconquest ended not with a battle, but a bonfire. Cape Bon wasn't just a naval defeat, it was the moment the Mediterranean ceased to be Mare Nostrum, our sea. For centuries, Roman control of the waves had been as unchallenged as its legions on land. Now, a kingdom of former pirates ruled the waves, strangling the empire's grain supply and erasing any illusion of revival. The disaster broke Leo's treasury and his spirit. He'd spend the rest of his reign fending off riots in Constantinople as bread prices soared. Yet the flames of Cape Bon illuminated a deeper truth. Rome's fractures weren't just military but spiritual. Even as the fleet burned, bishops in Alexandria and Rome were excommunicating each other over theological squabbles, dividing loyalties when unity was vital. The next catastrophe wouldn't come from foreign fleets, but from within, a holy war between Christians that would leave the empire's soul as gutted as its navy. And waiting in the wings, the Ostrogoths watched, their swords loose in their scabbards. The fog that clung to the Frigidus River in September 394 AD wasn't just meteorological, it was symbolic, a shroud over an empire tearing itself apart. The Battle of Frigidus should have been a unifying moment, the last time a single Roman emperor would rule both East and West. Instead, it became a grotesque spectacle of brother against brother, Christian against Christian, as Theodosius the Great clashed with the usurper Eugenius. This wasn't just a civil war, it was a death blow to Rome's fading unity, masked as a triumph. Theodosius, the devout emperor who'd made Nicene Christianity the state religion, framed his campaign as a holy war. Eugenius, though nominally Christian, had courted pagan senators desperate to revive old gods. But the real tragedy wasn't theological, it was logistical. Theodosius's eastern troops, many of them Gothic mercenaries, were thrown into the meat grinder first. Ancient sources claim 12,000 of them died in a single day, their bodies left to rot as sacrificial pawns in a political game. Then came the Bora, the alpine wind that saved Theodosius's legacy. Roaring down the valley, it reportedly hurled Eugenius's arrows back at his own lines while blinding his forces with dust. Theodosius spun it as divine intervention, but the truth was uglier. Rome's survival now depended on weather and barbarian swords. Frigidus exposed the empire's hollow core. Theodosius won, but at what cost? His reliance on Gothic federates set a deadly precedent. Barbarians now held the balance of power. Worse, the battle accelerated the East-West divide, with the two halves of the empire increasingly pursuing separate destinies. Theodosius died months later, leaving the throne to his incompetent sons. Within a generation, the West would collapse under barbarian invasions, while the East limped on as Byzantium. Yet the most damning legacy of Frigidus was spiritual. This was a war where both sides invoked the same Christian God, proving faith had become just another weapon. The empire that had once thrived on pluralism now fractured over doctrinal squabbles, its leaders too busy policing heresies to notice the real threat massing beyond the Danube. And as Rome's bishops bickered over theology, a new generation of Gothic leaders watched, learned, and waited for their moment. The next time they crossed the Frigidus, it wouldn't be as mercenaries, it would be as conquerors. The fields of Palencia should have been a triumph, an Easter Sunday in 402 AD where Rome's last great general, Stilicho, turned the tide against the Gothic king Alaric. The battle was technically a Roman victory, but the kind that left both sides staggering, bloodied, and more dangerous than ever. Stilicho's legions had caught Alaric's forces off guard during their holy day, a move some called brilliant, others sacrilegious. The Goths, mid-feast and unarmed, fought like cornered animals, their women and children joining the fray with knives and cooking spits. By dusk, the carnage was so indiscriminate that even Stilicho's own officers hesitated. This wasn't strategy, it was butchery dressed as salvation. Palencia's bitter irony, it solved nothing. Alaric escaped with most of his army intact, seething with a new, personal hatred for Rome. The Gothic king hadn't wanted this war, he'd sought land and recognition for his people within the empire's borders. Now, humiliation festered into vengeance. Within 8 years, he'd be back at the gates of Rome itself, not as a supplicant, but as a conqueror. Stilicho's victory had only delayed the inevitable, and at a terrible price, the goodwill of thousands of Gothic warriors who might have been allies. The real lesson of Palencia wasn't about tactics, but trust. Rome's leaders, desperate to project strength, had forgotten that empires survive by assimilation as much as annihilation. Every Gothic child who watched their parents cut down at Palencia grew up nursing a grudge that would fuel the sack of 410. And as Stilicho basked in his hollow triumph, a far darker storm gathered in the east, a nomadic horde so ruthless they made the Goths look tame. The Huns were coming, and their arrival would expose Rome's gravest weakness, an empire so busy fighting its friends, it had no strength left for its enemies. But before the Huns could rewrite the rules of war, another Roman blunder would hand them the perfect weapon, a refugee crisis turned into a recruiting ground, where desperation met opportunity on the banks of the Danube. The next defeat wouldn't just cost Rome land, it would arm the very force that would eventually break it. The Catalonian plains should have been Rome's finest hour, a last desperate alliance of Romans and Goths standing shoulder to shoulder against Attila's apocalyptic horde in 451 AD. Flavius Aetius, Rome's last great general, had pulled off a miracle uniting former enemies under the banner of survival. The battlefield itself became a slaughterhouse of epic proportions, with chroniclers claiming the corpses piled so high they altered the landscape. Yet this Pyrrhic victory carried a bitter irony. In stopping Attila, Aetius may have hastened the very collapse he sought to prevent. Attila's strategy was pure psychological terror. His Hun cavalry, faster and deadlier than anything Europe had seen, feigned retreats to lure Roman Gothic lines into chaos, but Aetius, a former hostage among the Huns, knew their tricks. He anchored his center with the Visigothic king Theodoric's heavy infantry, forcing Attila into a grinding melee where numbers mattered more than mobility. Theodoric died in the carnage, his son Thorismund avenging him in a charge that nearly took Attila's life. By nightfall, the Huns retreated, but so did Aetius. He let Attila escape, a decision historians still debate. Was it mercy, exhaustion, or did he grasp the grim calculus that without the Hun threat, his Gothic allies would turn on Rome? The battle's aftermath proved deadlier than the fighting. Aetius, hailed as the empire's savior, was murdered by a jealous Emperor Valentinian just 2 years later, a knife in the back for the man who'd held the West together. Meanwhile, Thorismund's Goths, no longer needing Rome's protection, carved out their own kingdom in Aquitaine. The fragile alliances that had stalled Attila unraveled like a frayed rope. Catalonian wasn't a triumph, it was a preview. Rome had proven it could still rally Europe against a common foe, but at the cost of revealing how little held it together without one. And as the empire's provinces fractured into petty kingdoms, a quieter disaster unfolded in the halls of power. The real threat wasn't the barbarians at the gates, it was the rot within. Emperors now ruled from gilded prisons, their strings pulled by Germanic generals who'd learned from Aetius's fate that loyalty to Rome was a death sentence. The next defeat wouldn't come on some distant plain, but in the very heart of the bureaucracy, where a clerk's pen would sign away the West's sovereignty without a single sword drawn. The end wasn't coming with a bang, but a whisper. The wheat fields of North Africa had fed Rome for centuries, their golden harvest shipped across the Mediterranean to keep the empire's belly full. But in 439 AD, the breadbasket was stolen not by siege or battle, but by a single cunning stroke. The Vandal king Gaiseric didn't just capture Carthage, he turned Rome's lifeline into a noose. One morning, the granaries stood full. By nightfall, they bore his crest. The loss wasn't merely territorial, it was metabolic, a slow strangulation that would leave the Western Empire gasping for survival. Gaiseric's brilliance lay in his patience. For a decade after crossing from Spain, he'd bided his time, playing Roman factions against each other. When the moment came, he moved with surgical precision. Carthage's gates swung open not by force but betrayal, a bribed garrison, a silent midnight coup. The city fell without a fight, its docks now launching Vandal pirates instead of grain ships. But the real masterstroke, Gaiseric didn't burn the fields. He kept them flourishing, then sold the harvests back to Rome at ruinous prices. The same wheat that once sustained the empire now funded its enemy's navy, a fleet that would soon dominate the Western Mediterranean. The economic shockwave was immediate. Rome's annona, the free grain ration that kept its million citizens docile, was halved, then quartered. Bread riots erupted as prices soared. The treasury, already bled dry by decades of crisis, lost its richest province. Africa had supplied 2/3 of Italy's grain and nearly half its tax revenue. Now those gold and wheat streams flowed into Gaiseric's coffers, financing audacious raids from Sicily to the Peloponnese. By 455, his confidence had grown enough to sack Rome itself, looting the imperial palace down to its gilded roof tiles. Yet the Vandals' greatest weapon wasn't their swords, it was their ships. Gaiseric, a landlubber turned sea king, realized something Rome had forgotten. Control the waves and you controlled destiny. His fleet became a mobile blockade, strangling trade routes and leaving Italian ports empty. When the Eastern Empire finally sent that ill-fated armada to reclaim Africa in 468, it wasn't just defeated, it was incinerated off Cape Bon, a funeral pyre for Roman naval supremacy. This slow-motion disaster exposed the empire's fatal dependency. Like a body addicted to one vital organ, Rome had centralized its survival in Africa's fields. No contingency plans, no diversified suppliers, just brittle reliance on a single province now in enemy hands. And as the West withered from this nutritional siege, the final blow wouldn't come from foreign conquerors, but from within its own ranks. The Germanic generals propping up the empire's corpse were about to realize they didn't need an emperor at all. The next defeat wouldn't even require a battle, just a quiet transfer of power, and the last Roman emperor would wake up to find his throne replaced with a pension. Ravenna in 476 AD wasn't a battlefield. It was a bureaucratic whisper, the sound of an empire exhaling its last breath without fanfare. When the Germanic warlord Odoacer deposed the boy Emperor Romulus Augustulus, there were no heroic last stands, no burning cities, just a quiet shuffling of paperwork. The irony, Rome's final conqueror wasn't even a foreign invader. Odoacer had spent years as a Roman general, his soldiers drawing imperial paychecks even as they answered to Germanic kings. His coup wasn't a barbarian onslaught, it was a pension dispute turned revolution, a mercenary realizing he no longer needed the employer. The real tragedy lay in how little changed. The Senate kept meeting, the baths still steamed, farmers tilled the same fields they had for centuries. Even Odoacer, now ruler of Italy, insisted he was merely governing in the name of the Eastern Emperor Zeno, a polite fiction everyone pretended to believe. If this was the fall of Rome, it felt less like collapse and more like a rebranding, the empire's shell repurposed by new tenants. But peel back the surface and the cracks were everywhere. The Western Empire's treasury was empty, its legions replaced by tribal warbands loyal only to their paymasters. The grand machinery of tax collection, road maintenance, and grain distribution, the real glue of empire, had rusted beyond repair. Rome didn't so much fall as dissolve, its power leaching away through 1,000 small surrenders. A border fortress abandoned here, a province left to fend for itself there. Odoacer's takeover was just the receipt, not the bill. Yet to call this purely a defeat misses the paradox at empire's heart. The Eastern Empire, now Constantinople's Byzantium, would cling to Roman titles and laws for another 1,000 years. Latin evolved into Italian, Roman roads became medieval trade routes, and the Church preserved imperial bureaucracy in its dioceses. Rome's ghost lingered everywhere, whispering through the coronation rituals of Germanic kings who still craved its legitimacy. Which brings us to the unanswerable question: did Rome fall, or did it simply shed its skin? Perhaps empires never truly die, they just fracture into fragments that others reassemble. The lessons of these 23 defeats aren't about how civilizations end, but how they transform under pressure. Every catastrophe forced adaptation. After Cannae, Rome learned flexibility. After Adrianople, it relied on barbarian troops. Even in collapse, it bequeathed its conquerors a template for governance. The takeaway: no empire is immortal, but the best leave fingerprints on the future. Rome's defeats weren't just failures, they were rehearsals for the next act of history, where Visigoths quoted Virgil and Carolingian emperors wore fake togas. The eagle's shadow stretched far beyond its flight, and as we look at our own modern powers, perhaps that's the most humbling lesson of all. The true measure of greatness isn't avoiding falls, but how far your echoes travel after the crash. Constantinople's walls had stood for 1,000 years, shrugging off 23 sieges like a colossus brushing away flies. But on May 29, 1453, the impossible happened. The last fragment of Rome gasped its final breath. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II didn't just bring an army to the Theodosian walls, he brought a revolution. His monstrous cannons, cast by Hungarian engineers and dragged across Thrace, fired stone shots weighing half a ton, each impact shaking the ancient defenses like earthquakes. For 53 days, the Byzantines patched breaches with rubble and prayers until the unthinkable became inevitable. When the Janissaries poured through the shattered gates, Emperor Constantine, the 11th namesake of the city's founder, tore off his imperial insignia and charged into the melee, vanishing into legend. By sunset, the crescent flag flew over the Hagia Sophia, its Christian mosaics hidden beneath plaster. Yet was this truly Rome's end? The debate still rages. In law, culture, and unbroken bureaucracy, Byzantium was Rome, just speaking Greek and trading senators for eunuchs. Its scholars still quoted Cicero, its emperors traced lineage to Augustus. But the empire that fell in 1453 was a ghostly echo, its territory barely beyond the city walls. Mehmed knew the symbolism, declaring himself Caesar I Rum Caesar of Rome and adopting Byzantine court rituals. Even in death, Rome refused to die cleanly. Its legacy slithered into new hosts. The siege's true tragedy wasn't the fall itself, but the agonizing near misses that might have saved it. A handful of Venetian ships broke through the Ottoman blockade, but the reinforcements were too few. The last desperate plea to the West for unity against the Turks arrived too late. drowned by centuries of schism between Catholic and Orthodox. And those game-changing cannons, the Byzantines had once owned the same technology but let it gather dust in their armories, trusting old walls over innovation. Constantinople's fall wasn't just a military defeat, it was a reckoning with time. Rome's genius had always been adaptation, learning from Cannae, reforming after Adrianople. But the empire that once absorbed shocks like a sponge finally hardened into brittle ceramic. The Ottomans, by contrast, were Rome's dark reflection, taking its administrative brilliance but pairing it with relentless evolution. As the last Byzantine chronicler lamented, the city fell not from the strength of its enemies but the failures of its friends. And so Rome's story ends not with a single crash but a fade to grey. Long after 1453, Russian Tsars and German Kaisers would claim the mantle of the Third Rome, proving that empires outlive their geography. The final lesson: civilizations don't die when their walls fall. They die when they stop believing they can rebuild them. Rome's deadliest enemy wasn't the Goths at Adrianople or the Persians at Carrhae. It was the rot festering within its own halls. For all the empire's staggering military defeats, none cut deeper than the slow, self-inflicted wounds of corruption, greed, and the delusion that growth could last forever. Historians love debating which battle ended Rome, but the truth is far uglier. Empires don't collapse from single blows. They commit suicide by 1,000 cuts, tax collectors squeezing provinces dry, elites hoarding wealth while legions went unpaid, bureaucrats selling offices to the highest bidder. The Roman economy became a pyramid scheme, reliant on constant conquest to fund the last conquest, until the borders stretched so thin they snapped under their own weight. Take the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year spiral where emperors were crowned in barracks and murdered before their portraits could reach Rome. The currency was so debased that soldiers demanded payment in salt, the origin of the word salary. Cities built walls not against barbarians but taxmen. And when Diocletian tried to fix it with price controls, markets collapsed further. This wasn't just bad luck, it was systemic failure. The empire had grown addicted to plunder, unable to sustain itself without fresh loot. By the time Alaric sacked Rome in 410, the treasury was so empty he left with little more than ceremonial trinkets. The real wealth had long been siphoned away by graft. Parallels to modern empires are uncomfortable but undeniable. Like Rome, the British Empire's overextension left it vulnerable, winning 2 world wars only to bankrupt itself. The Soviet Union's collapse wasn't due to NATO tanks, but a bloated bureaucracy that couldn't feed its own people. Even today, superpowers confuse size with strength, mistaking GDP for resilience. Rome's ghost whispers a warning: no amount of military might can outlast a society rotting from within. Yet there's a twist in this tragedy. Rome's greatest legacy isn't its falls, but its rebounds. After Cannae, it rebuilt. After the 3rd century, it reformed. Even the fall of the West birthed Byzantium's 1,000-year twilight. The lesson isn't that empires die, it's that they choose to die by clinging to past glories instead of adapting. The barbarians at the gates were never the real threat. It was the blindness of those who refused to see the gates were already crumbling from within. And perhaps that's the most haunting echo of all. The realization that the only defeats that truly last are the ones we don't learn from. Rome's 25 most devastating defeats aren't just ancient history. They're a mosaic of hubris, miscalculation, and the brutal truth that no empire, no matter how mighty, is immune to collapse. Yet what's most astonishing isn't how often Rome fell, but how stubbornly it rose each time, dusting off the ashes of disaster to rewrite its destiny. These battles weren't just failures, they were brutal classrooms where Rome learned the cost of overreach, the danger of inflexibility, and the necessity of reinvention. The sack of the city by Brennus's Gauls, a wake-up call that birthed military reform. The annihilation at Cannae, a lesson in tactical humility that forged Scipio Africanus. Even the slow unraveling of the Western Empire revealed a paradoxical truth. Collapse isn't an event, but a process, one that modern superpowers would do well to study. What makes Rome's story so gripping isn't its triumphs, but its scars. Every crushing defeat exposed a weakness that, once acknowledged, became a catalyst for evolution. After Carrhae, Rome stopped underestimating the Parthian cavalry. After Teutoburg, it accepted that some frontiers couldn't be conquered, only contained. And when the Goths stormed Rome in 410, the shockwaves forced the empire to confront its own hollow core. Resilience wasn't just about bouncing back, it was about listening to the whispers of failure before they became screams. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who spent his reign fending off invasions and plagues, put it best: the obstacle becomes the way. Rome's greatest legacy isn't its golden age of peace, but its stubborn refusal to let disaster have the last word. Those 25 defeats weren't the end of the story. They were the turning points that shaped an empire's soul. So what do you think? Which of Rome's stumbles shocked you the most? Was it the arrogance that led to Caudine Forks, the betrayal at Teutoburg, or the quiet bureaucratic decay that made Augustus's coup inevitable? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's debate which lessons from history's greatest empire still echo today. And if you found this journey through Rome's darkest hours as fascinating as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Because history isn't just about the past, it's a mirror, and the reflections staring back at us might just hold the keys to our future.